Okay, hi everyone. A very warm welcome to panel 2B on internet governance during the pandemic. I'm Angela Daly from the University of Dundee, currently visiting the University of Bologna in Italy, and I'm going to be the chair of this session. We've got 3 papers in this session, one on Latin America, one on Israel, and one on China, so quite a good international reach. All of the papers really look at different aspects of internet governance during the context of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are still living through at the moment. And each one kind of concentrates on something slightly different. The first paper is quite comparative, looking at different countries in Latin America. The second paper looks very specifically at the Israeli case and some of the particular features of the pandemic response, particularly around the involvement of the security services. And the third paper looks at China's response, particularly with regards to fake news and misinformation in the pandemic context. I'll introduce the speakers in a second, but I would like to first introduce the discussant for this session, who is Alison Gillwald from Research ICT Africa and the University of Cape Town, Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance in South Africa. So Alison will be offering some comments on all of the papers, and we're very lucky to have her. The session, given that we've only got 3 papers, I can give each speaker a little bit longer than maybe what they were planning. So we can probably do 10 minutes for each speaker, for each paper. We'll do 3 papers one after the other, and then I'll hand over to Alison for her comments. And she can probably also go up a little longer to 10 minutes as well. I'll give everyone, in fact, speaking a warning when you've got 1 minute to go, and then I'll tell you when we've got to stop to make sure that we keep to time. So I would like to kind of first invite the speakers for the first paper on digital policies in Latin America in the time of pandemics. Bernadette Califano from the Universidad de Buenos Aires and Martin Becerra from the Universidad Nacional de Quilmes. The floor is now yours. Really looking forward to your presentation.
Hello to everyone. I'm glad to be here participating at the GigaNet Symposium today. As Angela said, my name is Bernadette Califano, and I will present a work written together with Martin Becerra. We are both researchers at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina, and we work at the University of Buenos Aires and at the National University of Quilmes. The title of my presentation is Digital Policies in Latin America in Time of Pandemics. The purpose of the work is to analyze policy interventions to address digital inequalities in 5 Latin American countries. We have chosen Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, since they are the biggest countries in terms of economies and population. During the first 3 months after the outbreak of COVID-19, that is to say from March to June 2020. My presentation is organized as follows. First, I'm going to give an overview of the status of connectivity in these countries. Then I'm going to explain the actions and regulations implemented by governments to face the pandemic in this period. And finally, I'm going to provide some insights on digital policies at a regional level. Let's begin with the overview of the status of connectivity in these countries. In this first chart, we see the internet world penetration rates by region for the first quarter of 2020. We can observe that Latin America and Caribbean countries had at this time a 70.5% of internet penetration rate. This was above the world average that was around 58.7%, and also outperforming countries in Middle East, Oceania, Asia, and Africa. Nevertheless, these numbers also show that there are 30% of disconnected people in the region, that is to say 187 million inhabitants. And also that a more thorough understanding should be sought regarding the 70% of connected people. We ask ourselves, what type of connections do they have? If they are fixed or mobile connections, what about access qualities? What about data upload and download speeds in each of the countries? In this second chart, we see that although internet penetration rates have been increasing over the past years in all of the 5 countries we are analyzing, they are still far from reaching figures comparable to North American or European countries. In the following chart, we see that the growth in subscriptions have been greater in the segment of mobile connectivity in these countries, with growth peaks, for example, in Brazil or in Chile. And in this last chart, we compare fixed and mobile broadband data download speeds in June 2020. And we see that there are major gaps in the region in terms of data download speeds, both via fixed and mobile broadband. Most of the countries are below the world average for data download speed through fixed internet. Only 2 countries, Chile and Panama, were above the world average at this time. And practically none is above the average regarding mobile broadband data download speed. Let's move on to the actions and regulations implemented by governments during the pandemic emergence. We have analyzed 4 variables. The first one is access and continuity of connectivity services. What we saw in the 5 countries we've analyzed is that all of the governments have taken measures to ensure the continuity and access to connectivity services, mainly to internet, but also to fixed and mobile telephony. Some of the countries presented initiatives to declare ICT services as essential or fundamental or public services. Most of them established minimum of connectivity commitments for telecommunication companies. And also they established prohibitions to discontinue services due to non-payment or the freezing of prices during the period of mandatory social isolation. Then we analyzed actions and regulations regarding traffic, data consumption, and content. What we saw is that following the enactment of mandatory social distancing measures, there was an increase in internet traffic in all of the countries. This was around 40% on average. Therefore, authorities implemented some measures to prevent networks from collapsing. All these measures were taken in agreement with the industry. These efforts included in the 5 countries commitments by over-the-top content providers to lower the quality of streaming of audiovisual services, some initiatives to release premium signals or content for no extra charge to existing subscribers, and also 0 rating agreements with telecommunication carriers, which enable people access to official sites, health websites, educational portals, social platforms, among others. The third variable we analyzed was infrastructure, network management, and radio spectrum. What we saw here is that although the digital divide became evident between countries and regions of each country at this stage, particularly in areas with no connectivity at all, and also taking into account that the main mobile carriers explicitly requested to expand the granting of licenses in spectrum bands, governments did not consent, at least the 5 governments we've analyzed. In Latin America, in this period, only Panama, Peru, and Ecuador enabled the allocation of radio spectrum on a temporary and free basis. And we noticed also that long-term infrastructure plans were not a priority at this stage. Finally, our last variable, we analyzed what we call compensations for telecommunication companies. We saw that in consideration of the agreements and commitments signed between governments and telecommunication companies, these received some benefits which range from the suspension of deadlines to comply with administrative procedures, such as terms of validity for permits, authorizations, or licenses, to the deferment of the enforcement of fines, liabilities, or tax payments. To conclude, we want to present some insights on digital policies in the context of pandemic emergence. We found more similarities than differences in the 5 countries we've analyzed. Among the similarities, we can say that these policies show somehow the inertia of the private orientation of the sector, and that was evident in the lack of measures to repair the serious gaps in ICT access and skills. The policies were mainly aimed at sustaining the networks in the face of the growing traffic demand. They also provided continuity of connectivity services, mainly focused on people with a lower payment capacity, but only focused on people who already had connectivity service before the pandemic. We believe that the policies were oriented somehow to develop some opportunities for social use of ICTs through the establishment of zero rating agreements, which enable people to access to information, education, and health services applications. And these policies were also supplemented by some decisions made by the industry, as I have already explained. Among the differences, we believe that the cases of Brazil and Mexico's, the measures implemented by these governments to generate inclusion were more timid than in the other 3 cases. Argentina, Chile, and Colombia implemented some extraordinary measures in this period to ensure the continuity of services in case of late payment or non-payment. And these countries, plus Brazil, presented initiatives to declare as public services some ICT resources. We believe that these kind of measures address one of the aspects that the first and exceptional actions did not take into consideration, that is to say, the population without any access to ICT services, a circumstance that was prior to the pandemic and that will be unfortunately aggravated by its economic consequences. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I remain here if there are any questions or comments, and also we can continue discussing these matters on social media. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bernadette, and also thanks a lot for finishing exactly on time. Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to move to the next presentation. If you do have questions, just remember them, and we will have time at the end for more questions. So moving to the next presentation, I would like to welcome Sharon Haleva-Amir from the School of Communication at Bar Ilan University in Israel, who is going to present her paper on the road not taken, Israel, COVID-19 and the SHABAC.
Thank you, Angela. Good evening, everyone from Tel Aviv. I'm so happy to be here. Today I will be presenting how Israel tried to technologically handle the corona crisis. As we are all aware of, states had to use different means to stop the spread as much as possible. Israel is an interesting case study as it was the only democracy who employed its secret service, normally oriented at thwarting terrorism, to technologically track corona patients. State surveillance is not a new practice. However, digital measures enable a very detailed and richer data than has ever been possible before. The pandemic had accelerated the phenomena, and according to 1.0 project, as of May 2020, 35 countries, 22 of which were democracies, deployed surveillance measures. Contact tracing technologies have the potential to keep epidemics under control if positive cases contacts are isolated quickly enough. So we can't say that these are negative to start with. High CTT's adoption rate combined with isolation and quarantining can lower the reproductive number and thereby enable an effective control of the epidemic. When we speak about CTT, we refer to 4 main characteristics. First one is the overall structure, whether centralized or decentralized, the method of contact tracing, location data or proximity data, the mode of participation, whether it is voluntary or involuntary, and the identity of the CTT operator, public or private. Israel chose its SHABAC's monitoring tool as its primary CTT along a Ministry of Health initiated application entitled The Shield, in Hebrew, Hamagen, which was aired, though not given full attention and back up by the state. We can see here the characteristics of each of the CTT chosen. There was never a real chance of replacing the invasive tool with Hamagen voluntary decentralized app, as the government actions signified a reluctance to do so. I will now present a consideration consequences matrix I've created while referring to 4 fields: legal, democratic, socioeconomic, and epidemiological, to enable a better understanding of the reasons by which the chosen route Israel have taken to tackle pandemics failed to succeed. When we speak about legal consideration, there was an inherent and non-proportional infringement of the right to privacy, a harm to the freedom of movement, unlawful data accumulation because no one was asked whether he was willing to give his data, a slippery slope as sometimes surveillance measures that do not stop when the crisis is over. And indeed, we saw such example last week when the Omicron variant returned to our life, and there was the first moment decision of the government, the new government, that she should employ the SHABAC tool again. And inter-authorities data leakage, almost no separation of powers between authorities, and inconsistency with the GDPR due to a very, I would say, harsh breach of privacy, which might have caused Israel an enormous economic damage. Moving to democratic consideration, there was a sense of digital dystopia and permanent surveillance, resulting in latent protest as people bought dumb phones and left their phones at home. There was also a harm to the prestige of the Secret Service, gradual reduction in the public trust, and thereby people were not willing to follow instruction, and a dangerous precedent for the use of overly intrusive tools for purposes other than counterterrorism. If we move to the socioeconomic consideration, then we have seen that the use of data location instead of proximity location data resulted in an inaccurate geo-tracking and unjustified self-quarantine for hundreds of thousands of people, out of which only 13.5% were proved to be COVID-19 positive. And as was shown in one of the Supreme Court ruling referring to the surveillance measures, there was a damage of more than 1.2 million working days lost. And if we refer to the epidemiological considerations, we might have thought that perhaps this tool was invasive but useful, but no, it wasn't even useful. Its identification rate was only 3.5%, compared to the epidemiological investigation and the identification rate of 24%. The tool unnecessarily sent into quarantine 3 to 8 times as many people than epidemiological investigation. And due to their reliance on the technology, there was no attempt to increase the number of human investigators, and thereby we had many sick people. So sometimes we must learn lessons that we can use to set a pandemic management public policy for future instances. So the first thing we should learn is the proportionality. The second thing is that a state should follow privacy by design principles when trying to think of a CTT. Another thing is to stick to one technology, promote, explain, and publish its method of operation, etc. And this wasn't the case in Israel when we refer to Homogen, and people just didn't download it or otherwise took it off after downloading it. Giving full ongoing detailed report on the data that the state holds. It will maintain high rates of public trust and will increase the public collaboration with the instruction. Setting organized periodical procedures to justify data accumulation will raise the government's decisions, transparency, and lessen erosion of public trust while minimizing citizens' insurgent behaviors. Another thing is to implement judicial review to maintain authorities' separation of powers and enable public deliberation and criticism. Designating authorized officials to handle data, as well as giving specific permissions, will minimize data leakage and privacy breach. And last but not least, studying cost-effective analysis all through the way will enable comparing the predicted improvement vis-a-vis predicted harm. I will finish with the words of Judge Daphna Barak-Erez in the Acre case, which referred to the monitoring by the SHABAC. And it was well put. Combating corona in the name of the basic right to life must not blind our eyes from seeing all other human rights. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Sharon. And again, thanks a lot for being exactly within time. Wonderful. That will also give us plenty of time for discussion afterwards, I hope. So I'd now like to turn to the third presentation, where we're traveling this time virtually to China. So the speakers are Wang, Zining, and Sharon. And we will somebody needs to turn their I think I've got that power. Right, okay, sorry about that. So our speakers are going to talk about their empirical research on how China has approached the issue of infodemics with regards to stakeholders and algorithms. So I'll hand over to you, Zining and Xingqiu.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for paying attention to my sharing. I'm Zining Wang from Peking University in China, and Xingqiu is my tutor. The topic I'd like to talk about is an empirical research on how to tackle infodemic in China from the perspectives of stakeholders and algorithms. Bursting in January 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused, sorry, there's something wrong with my PowerPoint, so I just show in this way. Okay. Bursting in January 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused over 5 million deaths, along with the spread of the virus. Misinformation and disinformation are threatening the internet over the world. I believe that many of you guys may heard that someone stated that the tobacco can restrain the virus, or 5G signal tower can transmit COVID-19 virus, and some politicians accuse China of the Wuhan virus. These are all why WHO stated that we human beings are now actually facing two pandemics, the COVID-19 pandemic and the infodemic. Till now, 132 nations have reached a statement on infodemic, and 52 nations have pushed the regulations on infodemic. but rumors are still spreading, especially about the vaccine or the origin of the virus. So it's worth thinking about what is infodemic is and how to control it. After the literature review, I'd like to explain the concept of infodemic with 5 characteristics. WHO defines an infodemic as an overload of information, and Grimes argues that each of us is a rumor carrier. Greenspan and Lofters trace the infodemic more as a continuous process. And Fong suggests that the double loss of information order at the top-down and the bottom-up level is the root cause of the worsening of the trust epidemic. So here comes the question: why do we pick China for research? In the picture above, the colors from blue to red represent the severity from mild to severe. We can see that the infodemic in China is not that severe compared to other nations with a large population. And in January 2020, though China has the most cases of COVID-19, its infodemic risk index is quite low. In January 2021 and December 2021, the infodemic risk index of China is still lower than many other nations. There are 1 billion internet users in China, and according to the definition of infodemic shown before, everyone is a rumor carrier, but the infodemic in China is not that severe. So our research tried to figure out what has China done to tackle infodemic. Due to the fact that there is no mature model for analyzing the responses to infodemic, we try to propose a new model. China's main prevention and the control modes for blocking the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic can be summarized as 3 parts: blocking the spread of the virus, treating infected people, and improving immunity of the public. Some scholars have summarized 3 types of recommendation algorithms in information dissemination: content-based recommendation, collaborative filtering recommendation, and knowledge-based recommendation. Regarding the participants in the governance of infodemics, Liu and some other scholars suggest that the governance body of the multiple co-governance of internet rumors consists of 3 parts: governance as the dominance of the good governance, the public as a foundation, and the non-governmental organizations as a link in the structure. With the theories and the practical experience, we propose the BPI model, which refers to block, push, and intervene. In a nutshell, the BPI model is based on the juxtaposition and integration of the 3 types of recommendation algorithms and the 3 major measures for the prevention and the control of the COVID-19 pandemic. The 3 main bodies of the internet platforms, government departments, and internet users are included to block the transmission, push information to users accurately, and intervene in advance. The interrelated steps are the main framework which is applied to the algorithm participated infodemic management. In our literature, we adopted a mixed method research, integrating in-depth interviews and surveys. We interviewed staff from Central Cyberspace Administration of China, Tencent Jiaozhen, Sina Weibo, and Toutiao. And then we did a questionnaire survey on Tencent, Weibo, and Toutiao users to investigate their perceptions of the infodemic when using these platforms during the pandemic. From the interviews, we found that the joint rumor refuting platform created by Central Cyberspace Administration plays the role as a bridge linking all participants in combating infodemic. Internet platforms like Tencent, Weibo, and Toutiao use algorithms and manual methods to effectively and quickly identify rumors and accurately push the content of the facts through algorithms to minimize the impact of rumors. In the process of rumor refuting, there actually exist 3 steps: fact-checking with specialists and officials, blocking the spread of the rumor through keyword blocking and labeling rumors and pushing scientific and authentic information to the audience. When combating infodemics, there are mainly 4 kinds of entities involved: the scientific specialists, government departments, internet use platforms, and internet users. But local media, professional organizations, and many other players are motivated in the work. The interview basically shows us the stakeholders in tackling infodemic and the use of algorithms. But why do we need algorithms? Through the questionnaire with factor analysis and regression on WeChat, we found that location influences the relationship between objective infodemic severity and negative emotions, and gender influences the relationship between subjective participation in platforms and negative emotions. With the regression on Weibo, we found that the active reposting tendency was positively correlated with perceived negative emotions, while about Toutiao, age matters in the causal effect. Location, gender, behavior, and age are all value factors related to the influence of infodemic, and all of them can be used as clues for accurate push with algorithms. Therefore, algorithms are indispensable when tackling infodemic. But there are still some problems in tackling infodemic. Rumors are spreading globally, and the misinformation from one nation may appear on the internet platforms of other nations. But there is no mature mechanism for global cooperation now. So it's a need to construct a global framework to combat the infodemic. I really look forward to more global cooperation in tackling infodemic, and I hope to share the experience of China to help better solve this problem around the world. That's all for my sharing. If you have any questions about my research, you can text in the discussion area or contact me with email. Thank you all for your attention. Wish you have a nice day.
Thank you so much, Zining and Xingqiu. I would now like to hand over to the discussant, Alison. Alison, you have about up to 10 minutes if you want it, to offer your comments on the papers, and then we'll go to a more open question and answer discussion with everyone afterwards.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. I just wanted to say I was really excited when I read these papers and when I was asked by Roxana to be the discussant on this section, because I've also been working actually on COVID across these 3 areas as Research ICT Africa, and with governments providing technical assistance on the African continent and in forums of global governance. So I think this particular session really lends ourselves to thinking about, the practical application and the policy implications of some of our research and our more theoretical work. So, I think what's also, when I read the papers, it really, as I said, really drew out the fact that the 3 papers really deal with our expanding notions of internet governance and our own debates within GigaNet around, what kind of papers should be accepted for this. And as I said, I think, COVID's really highlighted that. The first paper is really concerned with issues of connectivity and quality, some of the supply side concerns around accessing the internet. And, there's been some debate within the GigaNet forums that, whether this is actually telecoms regulation and, what is in telecom, what is internet, this got to do with internet governance. And I think, what COVID's really highlighted is that these preconditions, the regulatory and policy conditions for these, these preconditions for internet governance, are absolutely critical, especially if one's, looking at these issues from the perspective of the Global South, where you've got, in fact, the majority of the Global South actually offline and discussions on internet governance being moot. And then the second paper is concerned with the issues of data governance that have increasingly grown on the internet governance and GigaNet specifically research agenda, and just really highlighted so many of these issues in the context of COVID around our more kind of traditional assumptions around very individualized notions of privacy and data protection towards forcing us to these kind of bigger considerations of collective interest and public interest, possibly, you know, at various times having to override these more narrow notions of private protection, and how, you know, how we need to ensure that rights and democratic processes are preserved while acknowledging the need to do this for, you know, public health crisis management, pandemic crisis management. And then, of course, the third area is this other area of content regulation, misinformation and kind of disorder management that is another critical growing part of internet governance. And of course, one of the biggest challenges around, as Zining was describing, the challenges around, you know, getting global cooperation to deal with these problems that are essentially, you know, trans-border and not just, cannot just be dealt with at the national level any longer. So, so I'm going to now go into the individual papers, but I think there's some interesting issues across the papers as well that are interesting to think about. So the paper on data governance, for example, you know, has quite nice typologies and kind of has the normative assumptions that go with kind of democratic concerns around transparency, around privacy, around freedom of expression, freedom of movement, that, you know, come up in a very nice multidisciplinary and multi-area analysis. You know, there's been quite a lot written on data governance. There's been quite a lot written on from the legal perspective, you know, from an economic perspective. But I think what's really nice about this, Sharon, is the really looking at it from, you know, economic perspective, the legal perspective, and then the epidemiological perspective as well, and particularly because of the, you know, issues around the failure of the contact tracing apps and those kinds of things. So I think they're just really interesting things there, which make Zining's paper, which essentially looks at issues of misinformation and control and management of misinformation without any of those normative assumptions at all, which is, you know, quite in contrast to the paper that goes before it. And I think quite a nice challenge to those of us that just move from those kind of normative, liberal, democratic kind of human rights assumptions to actually looking at how, in the case of a crisis, you could actually control this, you know, by really exploiting the potential of algorithms to make some of these decisions, which would be very problematic in many other jurisdictions. But I'm going to come back to that in a moment, Zining. So the first paper, as I said, I'm actually a former telecom regulator. My sort of doctoral work and all of that was on telecom regulation. So I was very excited by this paper. And of course, I've been involved with trying to develop digital indicators in the global south that the supply side data of operators simply can't capture in these prepaid mobile markets. So particularly interested in looking at Latin America, which in, you know, global south surveys that we've been involved in, it obviously scores so much better than Africa and some of the countries we were looking at. But I think what is really important about this is that, you know, it begins to move us from the purely supply side indicators that we see in the digital divide kind of debates and tries to go beyond that by looking at the issues of, you know, of quality, of connectivity, and the various measures that were taken in order to ensure that the networks were sustained during this period. So just, I think, Bernadette and Martin, if you are hoping to publish this paper, you would have to tap into some of those critiques of that supply side data, of the ITU data that you use. You can look at the after access survey, which provides a demand side assessment and really a better reflection of the kind of connectivity in that country, and then in these countries, and then of course also deals with some of the real challenges of digital inequality, which are not actually on the supply side at all, but relate to human development. So there are many parts of the world that actually have quite extensive mobile coverage, for example, but in fact, people are not connected in large numbers, as we know from Latin America, because of other, educational income and other kinds of constraints. So I think you would need to engage with that literature considerably more. But in terms of the kind of outcomes of the interventions, the digital interventions or the digital regulations or policies during COVID, I think what is very interesting, and again, I refer you to some of the non-academic work that has come out in COVID because of often the delays, that there isn't academic work within the multilateral institutions, within the ITU and within the UN, and particularly a series of ITU roundtables, economic expert roundtables that produced reports by Raoul Katz, who pulled together by Raoul Katz, that actually respond to some of these purely supply side and operator kind of assessments of what happened during COVID and with these COVID interventions. So I think if we look at your conclusions and we look at some of the conclusions from other regions in the world, which I think would be useful just at a very high level, not in the detailed comparison that you have, that the importance of these other connectivity issues or these other human development issues. So in the interventions that are made by the Latin American governments, they essentially are about sustaining and ensuring that the increased demand of those who are already connected is maintained. And of course, some relief packages and zero rating for those who are not. But nowhere do these interventions, whether in relation to spectrum, whether into compensation for operators, into these various very useful breakdown of the interventions that you provide, do they actually enable bringing more people online, actually getting those who are offline online. And in some of the work that we've done on the spectrum thing, I would argue that some of the longer term implications of this, because as you point out, operators have not actually, there's not been an extension of networks, auctions have been held up, and these kinds of longer term efforts to get more people online, there might be kind of negative longer effects, although at the moment it did bring more people online very often more affordably. It neglected to take a kind of the policy experimentation of allowing temporary spectrum for community operators, for other operators, niche operators that might have brought these people who were, just completely prevented from very often survival by being offline during hard lockdowns. And then just to go very quickly to the as I said, the very nice paper by Sharon. So the interesting thing I think in this paper is the normative context in the case of Israel, where in fact there is already this long tradition of state control, of very extensive state of emergency that goes back to 1948 or something like that, and so there's a kind of citizen acceptance of certain sort of things that are necessary for state security and that sort of thing. And as you point out, the state agencies that are whose services are deployed for the management of contact tracing, etc., are actually, at the start of the pandemic, are held in quite high esteem. These are respected and credible institutions. But in fact, the failures around the contact tracing actually affect their credibility and really kind of impact on the kind of trust you need in order for these apps to work. So I think it's a very interesting case in Israel because of the role that the security services play, and also the real struggle it was to get parliamentary oversight, to get limitations on data accumulation and these kinds of things that in many other environments would be regarded as absolutely essential or constitutionally essential. And I just refer you to a book that was produced by Lynette Taylor from Tilburg on data justice and the COVID, which actually got a big sweep of a lot of countries.
I had the privilege to work with her at Tilt. Yeah, I know.
Great. So I think drawing out some of those sort of things were quite good. We did a South African chapter, for example, that looks at the distinction between a state of emergency and a state of disaster in South Africa, which retains one's constitutional rights. So it acknowledges the overriding collective and public interest that's required in order to manage the health crisis, but it retains those collective rights. And so, so there's a lot more there that I'm afraid I won't have time to, but I hope it is picked up in discussions so that I can quickly just go to Zinling's paper and just say, look, this is a massive paper. I urge you to read it. In fact, it's broken into a number of chapters with this very detailed mixed methodology that's used, which includes these high-level surveys, this user perception analysis, which is also very, very interesting on how people actually perceive these misinformation, use of algorithms for misinformation management, and the very centralized process, which again is very useful to think about in terms of Sharon's characteristics of different kinds of data management and information management kind of systems. So she looks at whether it's centralized or decentralized, private or public, etc. So that typology actually is quite useful to look at your thing, which is of course a highly centralized system in which there is again quite high levels of acceptance of algorithms and and trust in algorithms. The algorithms are based on enormous amounts of data, of which many people are contributing to that data creation just by their activities online. And so I suppose the kind of one of the main issues that I wanted to raise there was that in your suggestion that the effectiveness of this mechanism, in contrast to the lack of effectiveness of the contact tracing in Israel, the effectiveness of this mechanism is something that could be exported or used in international collaboration with other countries, would be highly problematic because of the normative and political aspects of this of the misinformation management that you really don't highlight on all. So the political dimensions are completely absent from that. And as I said, I think it makes a nice change to some of the normative assumptions that are in some of the papers. But in terms of this being exportable or applicable to other countries, that raises very big questions, especially in the global south, where China has a lot of global and digital collaboration, because so many people are offline, and therefore the data is so problematic. People are largely invisible in the data, therefore one couldn't use algorithms for this kind of misinformation, which is rife on the African continent. And there's also lots of research that's going on into that. And of course, the really big difficulties with state efforts to manage misinformation, which are often abusive, politically abusive, actually acting on groups in society or dissent in society, even whether it's anti-vaxxers or whatever it is, that it's actually used for political ends, that sort of doesn't come up in the paper at all. Besides the fact that, as I said, we have most of the continent offline, and so one would have to look, or one sees that in fact a lot of the misinformation efforts are around civil society fact checkers, because the state doesn't have the capacity, and certainly algorithms couldn't be used in that context. But thank you so much. Such interesting papers.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Alison. Just before I open it up to the floor, I would like to invite the speakers, if they want to respond to any of Alison's comments, please feel free to do so, and you can go first, and then I'll open it up for a general discussion, questions and answers.
Thank you, Alison, very much for your comments. I've taken a lot of notes while you were talking. Thank you for for reading our presentations. I have many comments. I will only mention some of them. I agree with you that telecommunications are preconditions for internet governance, and that's something we have to learn after this pandemic. And mainly for people from the global south, from Latin America, as we present in our paper. What we saw is that, for instance, in Argentina and all of the countries we've analyzed, that there were many problems regarding how to continue with practices like educational practices by means of having only a prepaid connection on mobile phone for some people. No, it was something very, very difficult. What we try to do in this paper is to analyze, like in the first 3 months, these public policies implemented in some governments, by some governments. We believe that these policies were somehow reactive. I mean, with that, like they react quickly to the pandemic and to the connectivity demands that were posed by the pandemic. Fortunately, these countries have learned a little bit about the experience in Europe, where the pandemic arrived earlier. But afterwards, we need to think about public policies concerning long-term infrastructure plans. I agree with you that we didn't analyze this specifically in the paper I presented here, but we have to analyze the different levels of the digital device, the different levels of access, not only the material access that is the first precondition to exert a lot of rights, but also question ourselves about what kind of quality access, usage, abilities, educational constraints, as you mentioned. When we presented the paper, we have already finished the analysis. We are planning to continue the comparison between countries from March 2020 to December 2021. Therefore, I'm going to check about all the non-academic work and the roundtables of the ITU and the reports you've mentioned. But this is like the first analysis done regarding the first 3 months of the pandemic, where we found that these countries react in a similar way, like implemented similar policies and policies that will have to continue afterwards. Well, that's all, and thank you very, very much, Alison, for your comments.
Actually, I'll do it in order. So, Sharon, do you have any comments, or feel free to unmute if you want to?
I want to thank both you and Alison, and I want to say to Alison that indeed I had 2 ideas when I was working on this paper. The first one is that many have written about this issue, but they try to focus on it solely from one field, for example, only referring to the privacy breach or only referring to the democratic damage. But being an interdisciplinary scholar, my PhD is in law, and I study communication and new media and internet regulation and also information science, then I am used to look at things from many perspectives. So I was thinking that even if we postpone for a moment the issue, and it's not that easy to do it, but just for a second, let's say that this will assist the state in saving people's lives. And we just, we halt for one moment the privacy breach and the human rights breach and so on to save lives. But if we look at it from the complete picture, then we see that it didn't even save lives. It caused epidemiological damage, and it caused sociological damage to society, and it caused economic damage, and everything was wrong. And the state was not willing to receive the other application because they just said it's there, but people had to download it, of course, actively. And when they were thinking that we are already being monitored by our Secret Service, why should we be monitored twice? So there wasn't really a chance of people moving to the other applications, and even those who did moved. When they were monitored twice, it sometimes caused them to be susceptible to double option of entering quarantine. So there was no option, I mean, real option or practical option that the voluntary and non-invasive tool will replace the state tool. So moving in this way, I think that it was a real harm. And I think that as we saw last week when the variant of Omicron rose, we saw the same thing all over again, and with the new government, because that's the easy option of the government to go to. They don't even try something else. They just go to the easier option on their behalf, and they do not try to use privacy by design. They do not try to think of it as a whole and so on. And just because there was a huge cry out that people were not willing to be part of this thing all over again, then they had to step down and, because otherwise, like I said, it's a slippery slope. They put it once, they will put it forever. So I think that if we try to look at it from rather, I would say, a holistic perspective, then we can say that even if we do postpone for a minute the democratic and legal perspectives, we see that there was no use in using this tool. And it's of course a lesson for all countries. It's not only in Israel. So I think it is really important in when referring to internet governance, because it's our data and it's our freedom, our human rights and so on. And it doesn't save any lives, just the opposite way around. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I would just like to pass over to Zining and Xingqiu if they have any comments on your comments, Alison.
Thank you for your comments, Alison. Your comments really inspired me a lot. My research is, I shared before, it's just a starting point of a series of research because, the problem of algorithm is comprehensive, and my perspective of stakeholders and algorithm is just 2 points of a lot of perspectives, your comments inspire me that the privacy is really important issue. I like to share an instrument in China that of the people in China have a QR code, and whenever you reach, you have to scan the QR code to show people that you where have you gone, and are you healthy, and the QR code. But if I go to Poland and I didn't tell my tutor Xingqiu, and she will know because my phone is tracked, and the government and some institutions know my know where I am, and but if this data is stolen by some by some hackers, it's quite a big issue, I think. So I think maybe I should do more research on the privacy about the use of algorithms, and I think I think our research, as you mentioned, Alison, that some people are using internet platforms and they are affected by the algorithm. There are some, but there are 1 billion people using internet platforms, and there are still 400 million people that they don't use internet platform at all, and their perceptions of the pandemic or their perceptions of misinformation and disinformation may be greatly different from the people who use internet platforms. When I do the research, I suppose that the people who don't use internet platforms may affected by the people who use internet platforms because they may be their family members or friends. But now I think after the comments, I think that maybe the elderly may have some different ideas because there's some stereotype of something about the disease, about their social behavior or their life behaviors. Maybe they may be not affected by their family members. So yeah, it's a must to carry out another research, maybe about the difference between the elderly and the youngs of their perception of the epidemic and their behavior during the pandemic. That's all my comments. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And now the moment the audience has been waiting for, I'm now going to open up the floor for questions. I think maybe Dima wants to go first and has been waiting patiently. No, okay. Well, in that case, if anyone has any questions, please unmute yourself and ask them. I think, Xingqiu, do you have a question?
Yeah, no question, but as a co-author, I also want to say something. I'm very happy to be here because 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, the first time I attended GigaNet in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. So after 10 years, my student also can do some pre in GigaNet, so I feel very happy. And I do agree Alison's comments. I remember that 20 years ago in Oxford, I met Professor Bill Dutton, and at that time he was doing research about ICT's social shaping. So we need to understand the relationship between the technology and society. And I still remembered the grants model, the model of umbrella, the umbrella model. The model is just like an umbrella to show the ICT's relation with society. The handle of the umbrella, just the users. So users use the technology, but on the umbrella, first is the software and hardware, and then above the software and the software and is organizational infrastructure. So we need to understand the organization's characteristics, and above the organizational infrastructure, we need to understand the social system. So just now I found that Alison just asked Zining to pay attention to the social system, the Chinese social system. So I think it's very, very important for us to understand not only the algorithm, but the social system. So it's not easy for people to just imitate other people's model, but we need cooperation to understand each other. So thank you, Alison. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So questions or comments from those who haven't spoken yet in the audience? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask or a question or make your comment. But I will start, although I have been speaking already. But I'll ask one question, and maybe I'll take if Dima also has a question, I'll take it at the same time. Mine is a question for Bernadette. I was interested in the zero rating findings that you had, because I've been doing some work myself looking at net neutrality and zero rating, in this case in the UK and in Europe. And it's interesting that you mentioned that some kind of public health or educational websites were 0 rated. Can you talk more about that? And what about, were there any issues with net neutrality regulation if it existed in those countries? That's my question, kind of comment. Dima, do you want to go as well?
I'm happy to hear the answer, and then I can chime in with my question.
Thank you, Angela, for the question. Yes, what we saw is that all of the countries implemented zero rating agreements with telecommunication companies to provide some services for non-extra charge, because it's not free. These 0 rating agreements, you need to have already connectivity services or pay a plan for mobile phones. So these agreements, we found them in all of the countries. They enable people access to official sites regarding COVID information, also to educational portals. This was something important in very countries, as all the school and the university system was held online during these nearly 2 years. Also to social platforms in some cases. There were differences between countries regarding which apps and portals, applications and portals you could access with this 0 rating agreement. Something important you mentioned is net neutrality principles that don't go, I mean, they are opposite to 0 rating agreements. We believe that this was suspended, to say somehow. I mean, the net neutrality principles were, they didn't respect the laws in many of these countries. In Argentina, for example, we have a law that says that net neutrality should be respected, and we know that 0 rating practices do not agree with these principles because they privilege certain operators or certain apps or certain websites instead of others. And well, but these principles weren't discussed in most of the countries, and there wasn't a debate or a discussion whether these principles are, the 0 rating agreements go against net neutrality rules. And I believe that this is something that goes far beyond COVID situation. In Argentina, these principles are not discussed. We have some bills that are being discussed at the National Congress today, and they, if you read it, they go against net neutrality principles even without noticing. So it's something that we should continue discussing on these matters.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I would be keen to keep in touch about this, because also, at least in the UK situation, it seemed that it was against net neutrality principles, this kind of 0 rating, or potentially against them, but was sort of acceptable because it was in the public interest or for a kind of non-commercial reason. But in the law, there isn't really that distinction, at least in the law that we have anyway. So I would be interested, I think we can talk about this much more another time, perhaps, maybe in person. But it's interesting that there's kind of implicitly a somewhat controversial, maybe not controversial, public interest exemption from some net neutrality rules that is kind of emerging with these pandemic kind of free provision of information, and whether that lasts afterwards and in what situations it's allowed, I think is going to be a new direction for research in this area and policy discussions too. But I'd be very keen to talk more about this maybe separately. Okay, I've spoken enough now. Does anyone else have a question? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask it, or make a comment if you prefer.
So I have a question to Sharon. So I hear your critique of the use of ShinBet as a contact tracing agent, but I also wonder, having kind of looked at public perceptions of that move when it was initially introduced, where do other factors, particularly trust in government institutions, play into kind of public acceptance of such measures? It's like we had a survey in the field back in the day, and we saw that, you know, the Israeli Jewish public, right, was trusting the security services much more than they were trusting, for example, the Ministry of Health that was trying to promote that app, right, as kind of as inadequately as it was promoted. But I wonder whether in that given situation, there were other factors that might have potentially played into, you know, choosing one solution over the other in that particular context, if you had any thoughts about that.
Thanks, Dima. And first of all, you are, of course, correct. And the prestige, the intelligence community in Israel has is very high. And of course, if I try to compare it to what had happened in the States when they heard about the NSA, etc., it was quite the opposite, and there the citizens were not willing to receive it. So in Israel, people were willing to receive it, and therefore there was not really a huge protest, I would say. Most people preferred the SHABAC, even when we speak about preferring the SHABAC over a private society, company, sorry. But another thing that you were referring to is, of course, the thing that to start with, the corona came very surprisingly, and then they had to think of what to do. And although people in Israel didn't know that, and only Ronen Bergman told us this after the surveillance and monitoring had started, that the SHABAC had already used this surveillance tool for something like, I would say 12 years or something like this. So therefore, we would have thought that, okay, so Netanyahu was correct. He wanted to save life immediately, and he used a technological scheme that was already operating and working and could make sense. But eventually it didn't make sense, but they were so, I would say, in love with the idea that they were not willing to waive it. And even when they were supposed to, you know, to come to the Supreme Court and listen to what the judges were telling them, that there should be another option because this option is not proportionate. And when we speak about human rights and justice and law, and even basic laws, then it is well, and it is not forbidden, I would say, to waive some human rights for a worthy cause. But I would say the damage or the harm should be proportionate. And when the proportionate equation was not, you know, it was not equal in both sides of the equation, and the damage was more than the benefit, they should have thought about something else. And when they did not promote the other solution, and it was, of course, deliberately, because they were saying it in the Knesset, in the parliament, that it's no use, it will not work, it would not replace the tool we already have. Then they conveyed a double message to the citizens. On one side, we have the SHABAC, which has his prestige. On the other side, we have only, you know, for public relations another tool which is voluntary and optional, etc. But it was only for public relations. When people think, and of course, because they prefer the SHABAC, they wouldn't download the other app. And when they have, I would say, double jeopardy, then they wouldn't cause it to themselves. So I was thinking, even I'm just merely saying what I was thinking at the time. I was thinking, I'm already monitored by the Secret Service. If I download this, okay, and I'm not one of many, then the one who's taking the double jeopardy, it could be fucked, is me. So why should I do this? So citizens had no real reasons to do this. And of course, what has happened is that in due time, they had promised that they will take it off when the measures will go down and so on, but they didn't take it off. And thereby it started, I would say, a slow protest movement. And within due time, more and more people had started to oppose this. So even though at the beginning all were pro this tool, eventually it was not a good thing, even if we take into account the higher level of trust Israeli citizens have in their intelligence community. And of course, compared to other democracies, we are quite, you know, a platypus. We do not, we are not like any other country. But this is a matter of different article. I couldn't have, you know, merged it too much in here. So thank you.
Thanks very much. We only have 10 minutes left, so I would like to invite anyone who hasn't spoken to speak. If you have a question or a comment, please unmute yourself and make it, and direct it to a particular person if you want to. Okay, although it's spoken already, I will let Diva ask another question, but maybe I would ask for quite quick responses from the speakers, please, so that we can maybe have another question or two before the end.
I was just wondering if the speakers have any, you know, takeaways from their project as we prepare for the next pandemic. Like, what should we do differently, or what should we be thinking about as we move on, based on what you've learned from your studies?
Maybe given he's not spoken for a while, I'll ask Zining if he wants to go first, if he's ready to answer that question, and then I'll pass to the others.
Okay, yeah, that it's an interesting question, and I think the main takeaway of my project as we prepare for the next week of COVID-19 on the next pandemic, I think under the circumstance of risk case of society proposed by Baker, I think the next pandemic is rateable. So I think maybe we need to motivate more entities or participants to participate in the work of combating the next wave of COVID-19 or the pandemic, another pandemic. The problems caused by the pandemic is it comprehensive. It causes problems to the system of economy, to the transportation, and some other departments of the society. So I think everyone should be an actor in the stage of the combating of the pandemic. Even if I'm a student, I should learn more about the pandemic and maybe some of my family members are not that familiar with some scientific information, and I should tell them what to do during the pandemic. I should tell them to put the mask on and to wash their hands more often. Everyone has their occupation or their social status, the social characteristics, but everyone has their power to make contributions to the comeback of another wave of pandemic. In China, recently there seems to be another wave of pandemic, and I'm in Beijing, and in Beijing recently there are a number of cases, and I'm not allowed to go in or out of the school freely, and but I can follow the regulations. Yeah, if I went to the I go to the restaurant, I'll go to some other places like before, and I may be affected, and I participate in classes, and I eat in the restaurant, in the dining hall with some of my classmates, and I may transmit the virus to my colleagues. Yeah, I think it's bad, and it's my responsibility, or it's my ability to stay in my position and do what I can do to combat the COVID-19 or some other pandemic. So in short, I think everyone and every entity, some corporations, some government departments or non-governmental organizations should play a role in the process of combating in the preparation for the next wave of COVID-19 or another pandemic. Yeah, I think the efforts together is very important. Yeah.
Thanks. And sorry, I lost my connection for a minute there. So I hope there hasn't been chaos without me. I'm sure there hasn't. Any other speakers like to add anything if they haven't done already?
Yes, I can answer. First of all, I would like to say that I hope there's no other pandemic, and we finish with all these COVID waves. But besides that, and regarding my work, I believe that public policies regarding telecommunications and connectivity services must be articulated between public, private, and social sectors. We have analyzed mainly policies implemented by governments, and I believe that in many cases, the lack of agreement for implemented long-term infrastructure plans or for implemented measures or initiatives such as declaring some ICT services as public services need the agreement of the different sectors. These kind of issues are being discussed in several congresses in Latin America. And because telecommunication policies and access policies cannot be implemented without their agreement in a region where the private orientation of the sector that goes back to the 90s is still very, very important. And also to think about long-term infrastructure plans, as I mentioned before, in agreement with all these sectors.
Thanks. And I think Sharon has put her comments in the chat as something that she's already covered. So we've got a couple of minutes left. Does anyone have any final very quick questions or comments that they would like to make?
Thank you for a really interesting panel, and also for the really interesting and useful comments of Alison and all the people who asked questions, Angela, Dima, and all others.
Thanks a lot. Unless anyone wants to intervene just now, I will close the session. So this is the last chance. And if I don't hear anything in the next couple of seconds, that's it.
Thank you, Angela, Alison, and to all of you. I really learned a lot on this panel. So just only to thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much. And a really warm thanks to all of the speakers. Bernadette, Sharon, Zining and Xingqiu. Thank you so much for presenting your work. It's really great to hear about your work. I'll have to read it as well. I have to confess I didn't read it beforehand, but I've certainly more interest. You've piqued my interest that I definitely will be reading the papers afterwards. Thanks so much to Alison for all of her comments and constructive criticism for the papers and general comments as well. There's one on net neutrality, which I will be checking out myself. And thanks to people, the audience, those who asked questions, and GigaNet as well. So I think there are more panels coming. Hope to see you in one of them. But for now, that's it. Thanks a lot, everyone.